Shall we open our Bibles this morning to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verse 11. Nehemiah 2:11. As we continue our study through this wonderful book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah really starts for us in 446 BC. Nehemiah was a Jewish man born in captivity in Babylon who had gotten a job tasting the king's food for a living. Highly trusted, difficult place to get out of. And yet as folks came back from Jerusalem some 700 miles away, they always came with the reports of a city just laying like disastrous. No walls up, thieves everywhere, the reputation of the Lord and the shame of his people always being reported. And though the nation had been allowed to go home in 536, or some 90 years earlier, only about 50,000 people had gone home. The rest really liked city life and the ease of Babylon far more than the challenges and cost of living where God's name had been put. And so only 50,000 had gone back. Their goal was to build a place of worship again where God's presence could be with them. They laid the foundation before giving way quickly to political pressure and these carnal appetites of building their own homes. And for 16 years, nothing went on. It just kind of had a foundation poured, and that was it. It looked pretty bad. And Haggai was raised up by the Lord, Zechariah the prophet, and they went and they said to the people, how can you put God so far down your list? No wonder you're having such trouble in life. And by their encouraging words and prophecies, they got back to building, finished it in 516. 80 years later, from when the first group came, Ezra brought 2,000 kind of worship leaders, priests, those who could serve in the temple, teaching and all. And then 11 years later, Nehemiah would finally get a chance to cross that 700-mile stretch. But we learn from Nehemiah what it takes to get to where God wants you to be. And I'm convinced that it's the best book on leadership in the Bible because it focuses on that almost exclusively. But it's a great book for any kind of biblical principle that you might think you need when it comes to finding out where God wants you to be. It really is the working man's, study book, I think. And from Nehemiah, we learned in chapter 1 that sometimes when God begins a work, and most often, he starts in the life of one individual. There's not a whole lot of calling of groups in the Bible. There's usually a calling of a person. The group may eventually follow that person, but it's the work of God in your heart primarily first. And we looked in chapter 1 and saw that so often that calling is best identified by what breaks your heart. Because to Nehemiah, who had never been to Jerusalem, just the reports of the things that were going on killed him. It's something he couldn't live with. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't just idly stand by. The problem was he was stuck in a job that not only was 700 miles away, but really wasn't a job you quit from. You got killed from, but you didn't quit. And so he began to pray and ask the Lord, and in chapter 1, he made himself available. God, I'll be that guy that you can use if you'll use me. And for 4 months of nothing happening, he prayed and he fasted and his heart broke and he besought the Lord. And there really is a 4-month gap between chapter 1 and 2. And Nehemiah wasn't just idly sitting by, he was planning, which really is the lesson of the first 10 verses of chapter 2. He was planning, what if God would open the doors? What would I need to do if the Lord would do that? And boy, did he have a list. And by the time the king said, what do you want? He had an answer. And when are you leaving? He had an answer. And when will you be back? He was able to say, here's when I'll be back. And what do you need? Oh, I'm glad you asked. Here's my shopping list. And God, as he blessed him, and in verse 8 of chapter 2, Nehemiah said, because of the good hand of God upon me, I got everything I wanted, and I was finally able to leave and go to do a work. And he left for Jerusalem there at the end of verse 9 with 2 folks already upset that he was coming, though they had never met him, the enemy already up in arms about anyone that would be willing to help God's people. But we left Nehemiah last week on the road with official papers of commission from Artaxerxes the king and his PO lists in his hand for the king's hardware store, and the disgruntled few up on the hill upset. There is roughly a 3-month gap between verses 10 and 11. planning and travel took certainly that long. But this morning we'd like to look at verse 11 and down through the end of the chapter at a vision in the making. As we watch Nehemiah go from all that God had done to get him on the road to arriving into the place and then having to somehow encourage the people to join him. This was no project for one guy. This is a big city and it's a lot of wall. So 3 points: get the vision, share the vision, and the opposition. Verses 11 through 20. Let's start in verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem, and I was there for 3 days, and I rose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one upon which I rode. I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well, to the refuse gate, viewing the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, the gates burned with fire. And I went on to the fountain gate, onto the king's pool. There was no room for the animal under me to pass. And so I went up in the night by the valley, I viewed the wall, and then I turned back and I entered by the valley gate, and I so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews or the priests, the nobles, the officials, or any others who did the work. So Nehemiah shows up in town, and the first thing he needs to do is get a vision from the Lord as to what the work needs is going to involve. I like that so much because he's been praying for months. He had a list of what he thought he needed, but he'd never seen the place. So this was his first, arrival to finally get to see how bad the damage was. I get the feeling if I was Nehemiah, I'd right away want to start working. I mean, it's been, the better part of a year by the time everything is said and done. It's been burning in his heart, but he'd never been there. I mean, he'd read about the city in the scriptures. He'd heard about the destruction of the city from some friends who had come and gone. But now he gets to see it with his own eyes. And he must have needed some time to just say, all right, now that the Lord has brought me here, now what? I mean, how do we go about doing this work? And so you read, I was there for a few days, and he was there just waiting to see what the Lord might want to do. He wasn't frantic. He needed some rest. He needed to gather his thoughts. He needed to assess the situation. He needed to have the Lord speak to him. I mean, if this was going to be a work of God, then he was going to need the plan of God to accomplish the work of God. And with great diligence, he just began to run around to see what God might do. And he records for us that he went out on some of these secret night scouting missions. He wanted to see the wall from every side. He wanted to make sure that he had a detailed understanding of everything that had gone wrong. He mentions a couple of times he hadn't told anybody yet. And I think it's a great lesson if you're in ministry as a leader that you know what you're doing before you try to get others involved. So often folks just, they start backwards. They try to get people involved, and then they'll decide what it is they're doing. Hey, will you join me for what? I don't know. But it's going to be good, But you find Nehemiah planning and calculating. This was actions of great faith, but it's spiritual thinking, planning alone with God. And I think that so often the drawback for people in ministry is that they lack leaders who will sit and plan before they involve others, and they really don't have anything to share. Nehemiah had nothing. He had a vision, but he didn't really know how he was going to accomplish it. So he travels light. He tells no one. He's got some guys that the king had sent with him to kind of ride with him, but he goes out. In fact, he mentions again in verse 16, no one knew what I was doing, where I was going, what I was up to, what my plans were. I just went out at night and traveled around the city. And I thought, some official from the king with an armed escort going around your city every night would be a little disconcerting, What is he up to? What do they want? What's going on now? We don't have enough trouble? And yet it is this quiet seeking God that I think is absolutely needful if you're going to be a good leader in ministry and lead people into the work of God. Nehemiah needed time to plan. And so often I think that we think planning is not faith, but I suggest that it's the greatest part of faith, because then you have to rely on the Lord to work. Jesus said there in Luke 14, I think we talked about it last week, none of you is going to build a tower, but if you do, you don't first sit down and count how much it's going to cost to finish it. Lest being halfway through, you become the laughingstock. People say, well, look, he built the foundation. He's not able to finish the work. So Nehemiah was a wise kind of man. He went there, and you know, I think that so often we try to excuse our lack of planning by just saying, well, the Lord will lead us. But you can really only say the Lord will lead us if you've been out there to hear what he wants to do, right? Rather than just showing up and saying, well, I don't know what God wants to do, but we'll figure it out. You go find out what God wants to do first, and then you can pass that along. Faithfully seeking God behind the scenes. And I love the picture, you know, times of quiet, no activity, prayerfulness, thoughtfulness, trying to get clarity of thought. I personally believe that the process is the greatest work gets done here. You know, where God is able to speak to this man and put his ideas into his heart. Not just emotions, because there had to have been great emotion involved in seeing the destruction, you know, especially he cared so much for the people and for the Lord. But planning, making good decisions, and seeing the full scope of the work. If you don't do that, you never anticipate any kind of potential problems, and you certainly will not have much to share with people who want to ask you about what you're doing. You'll just say, well, I don't know, I'll just see. It's vital, I think, that this vision is born in your heart. And that's not something that you just find in Nehemiah. Prepared hearts make good leaders is found throughout the scriptures. You can't give people what God hasn't given you. You know, when Paul wrote to Timothy his last letter to a young man who was in the pulpit for the first time in Ephesus, he said to Timothy, you should be diligent to present yourself approved unto the Lord as a worker who doesn't need to be ashamed, rightfully dividing the word of truth. Prepare yourself, Timothy. Make sure that you're ready to stand before the people. Paul writes his letter to the Corinthians, talks about communion, which the church, as carnal as it was having great trouble with and kind of abusing. And Paul writes in chapter 11, verse 23 of 1 Corinthians, look, what I've received from the Lord, that I'm delivering to you. In other words, receive it first, then pass it along. That's absolutely vital, isn't it? Necessary. David, when he was being dealt with over that whole Bathsheba incident, and he finally wrote Psalm 51, said to the Lord in verse 12, restore to me the joy of my salvation. Uphold me with your generous spirit. Then I can teach transgressors your ways. Then sinners can be added unto you. When I am walking with you, then I can be useful to you. And it's always that way. You read about Ezra there in chapter 7 when he brought that second group over, verse 10, and you'll read the words, Ezra prepared his heart to seek the Lord's law, comma, and then to do it, comma, and then to teach and to teach the law, the statutes, and the ordinance to Israel. So he received from God, he walked in the things God had taught him, and then he began to teach others. So that's always the way it is. You know, even the disciples, when they were arrested there early on in Acts for that healing of the lame man at the gate, for the preaching of the gospel, you know, the Pharisees thought, this is getting out of hand. We got to put an end to this. And they started by making threats. They ended by beating these guys and setting them free. But they said finally to him, you can't teach anymore in this name of Jesus. And you read there in Acts chapter 4, verse 20, that the disciples answered and said, look, we can't help but speak the things which we've seen and heard. I mean, it's part of my life now. You know, God has spoken to me. I can't change now. I can't deny the Lord. And I love Nehemiah's example because he had seen great miracles to get to this point. I mean, he's absolutely been blessed to get here over these last 7 months. But no one really knows about it but him. And he doesn't want to change managers now. He shows up, and while everybody else was sleeping, Nehemiah was wide awake, virtually by himself, saying, God, what do we do now? How do we fix this? And he begins to plan again the very things that he'd been doing. Leaders who want to make a difference, I don't think can work 9 to 5. I think it becomes a part of your life. You hear from God, you walk with God, and then God uses your life. But he honestly, notice in verse 13 and 14 and 15, he honestly evaluates the work. I don't know how discouraged he must have felt looking at what he could only have imagined in his mind. You know, there were places that were so filled with debris, he couldn't even ride his horse around it. He had to get off and kind of, you know, go around. And how discouraged could you have been? Oh, man, I didn't bring near enough stuff. I mean, everything had been miraculous to this point, but he's not lost in the details. I don't find anywhere where Nehemiah goes, oh, man, it was worse than I thought. He just wants to accurately see and familiarize himself with the details, and he wants to understand what's going on. So he's making a list and covering the bases. And in verse 14, he travels the perimeter, to see it. If the reports back in the castle, in the palace, had brought him to tears, what do you think seeing it must have done? In fact, the word viewed in verse 13 and 15 here is the word to carefully inspect. Because true faith will plan, see things clearly, and then look to the Lord to work. Alan Redpath, who used to come to our pastor's conference a lot, he's gone to be with the Lord now, wrote a great book on the book of Nehemiah called Victorious Christian Living. I still think it's one of the best books, along with Swindoll's book, Hand Me Another Brick, that you'll read on the book of Nehemiah. But Alan Redpath wrote of this verse, when a real work of God is to be done, some faithful and burdened servant will have to take a long journey and weep in the night over the ruins. It is what stirs your heart, and it is the compelling concern that few others can share that indeed defines the work of God. So just like in chapter 1, Nehemiah was all by himself again, still burdened by what he was concerned about. The nice thing was now he was burdened in Jerusalem, not 700 miles away. Well, then having spent his time, not having told anyone, verse 16, it finally became time to involve others. And we read in verse 17 that he then finally said to them, the them referring to all the folks who hadn't known anything in verse 16, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, its gates burn with fire. Come, and let us build the walls of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. And they said, then let us rise and build. And they set their hands to this good work. Getting the vision has to eventually come to sharing the vision if you're going to have any influence at all. There's very few works of the Lord that are done solely by you. And certainly this isn't one of them. 4 months of praying and fasting, 3 more of travel, several days of viewing, and now he wants to pass along the vision to the people so that they might join him in the work that God has placed upon his heart. Now that's a big step to take. How do you convince others that what you're doing is from the Lord and that they should join you? There's never a good ministry that lasts for very long without a clear vision that is shared by everyone. You can't lead without a vision from the Lord, but you also can't lead unless the people can hear from God themselves. And so, unless you're able to share what the Lord is doing, people tend to be very frustrated in ministries where the leader is not sure what he's doing. But Nehemiah had it clear now. He showed up with everything that he could to lay before the people the work of God. And I wanted to point out just a couple of things that I think are very important for us. First and foremost, Nehemiah identified himself with the issues in Jerusalem. He was a Jew. He had never lived there, but it concerned him. He doesn't say, you all should have built it. You bunch of lazy, good for nothing, 160 years, couldn't you build sometime? He says, we're a reproach. We really, need to do some work. Let us go and build. It is always very difficult, I think, to ask people to do what you're not willing to do. And that frustrates most folks. Paul, when he wrote to Timothy was 40 years old when he took over in Ephesus. Paul was in prison. But he wrote to him in 1 Timothy while he was still out of jail, look, Timothy, don't let anyone despise your youth. So you that are 40, remember this. The Bible calls you your youth. Be an example instead of the believer in your word, in your conduct, in your love, in your spirit, in your faith, in your purity. Look, be that guy. So when you call others to be those people, they won't have you as an excuse why they won't walk with God. Be the example. In fact, the whole chapter 4 of 1 Timothy, Paul speaks almost solely upon his example to the flock. Nehemiah might have just come in and said, look, I'm here from the king. You guys are ridiculous. Build the wall. I'll be in the office. And just give me a call if you got any problems and let me know. But that's not a good way to lead. And Nehemiah identifies with the people. It's very hard when a Bible study teacher says to you, you got to go to church, and yet they're not in church. Or they're hanging out in the foyer. Or they're visiting in the parking lot, and they're doing like this to you. You know, you need more of the Bible. And you look at them and you go, where are you? You know, that doesn't help much. If it isn't in your heart, it probably won't be in their heart either. And people know the phonies from the true believers, don't they? And the leader should certainly be convinced of what he's sharing with others. The other thing that I find fascinating, and I think trying to put myself in Nehemiah's shoes, Nehemiah does not attempt at all to plead or bargain with the folks to join him. And I think I might be tempted to do that, you know. There are a lot of folks who, when they really believe God has stirred their heart, in order to get other people involved, don't bother waiting upon the Lord. They take it upon themselves to pass along the concern. And I think we mentioned last week that folks will say, you know, they'll lay some heavy duty thing upon you that they're working on, and they'll say, you want to get involved? And you go, no. And they say this, don't you care? No, not really. I don't, you know. Let me show you the PowerPoint. Maybe I can change your mind, you know. And is that God? No. Oh, brother, I'll be praying for you, you know. God could have done a great work, but except for you, you're in the way. And, you know, you can get some heavy-duty stuff laid on you at the church, right? The church has a great way of twisting your arm and pressuring you. I can't ever see the Lord doing this. Come on, serve Jesus. But it's the temptation. And Nehemiah doesn't do it. He is willing at every step to let God do the work. We mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago, he wouldn't just try to argue with the king why this would be good for the king, that he would go here. He doesn't bother to try to force the people here to get involved. He figures if God opens the door, he doesn't have to push the door open. Just share the vision. Get the vision, share the vision. Let God work. We have had a policy at Morning Star here since we've started, and I think only because I came in times past from places that decided forcing people to do something good was good. But we've had a policy that we would never go beyond sharing what the need might be in the church and then leaving it at that. If a classroom in the Sunday school needs a teacher, we will absolutely announce, hey, we could use some more teachers. But if nobody shows up, we just shut the class down. Because there's really no sense artificially, you know, pumping in life to something that God's not doing. If the Lord build the church, or like we read this morning, unless the Lord build the city, you're laboring in vain, then we have to practice what we preach and believe that God will stir the heart. You know, we have shut down ministries because nobody showed up. Or it wasn't going anywhere. And you might go, oh, but we so want to do this. Well, that's great, but apparently the Lord doesn't. There is no sense wasting your time and mine trying to beat you over the head. And you know, there's people that are good at it, man. They'll make you feel so bad, you just figure you better help. You know, they can talk the last $5 out of your pocket. I mean, there's people that are good at this stuff. But I don't want to be good at that. I want to be good in just teaching you the Bible and letting God stir your heart. And if he doesn't, hey, I'll go home. You know, I'll go do something else. But God doesn't need my help. Doesn't need your help either. So I love Nehemiah's approach. He doesn't try to persuade them, if you will, other than just to appeal to their spiritual senses. Look, this is our city. This is the city God gave us. Our place lies in ruins. You know, I would like to join you and work to get this resolved. Eventually, Nehemiah would have 42 groups that would work together. 42. He was a pretty good organizer. But I love the fact that, you know, every work of God needs every person. I wouldn't do too well up here teaching you if we had no nursery. 30 kids screaming or gaga goo goo over the pew at you, you know, you're not going to be paying good attention. So we need each other, right? Everyone has a part to play. And I love that Nehemiah, his appeal to them was personal. He was a part of them. He didn't pander to them, but he did appeal to their spiritual well-being. And he doesn't offer them any rewards. It's interesting how often rewards become an issue when it comes to people trying to convince you to do, you know, the things for the Lord. I grew up as a kid, maybe you did too. Schools are really good at rewards for behavior, you know. Now, if you eat all your Brussels sprouts, at least that's what we ate when we were kids, then you get dessert. If not, what happens? No dessert. Oh, it's the old reward system, you know. You get more A's and B's, you know, you'll get to go to Disneyland. Oh, reward system. And then you get saved, and it comes with you. The old reward system. But notice Nehemiah doesn't say a weekend at the Dead Sea for the ones who sign up the most workers. I think rewards are never the best motive for serving the Lord, because unfortunately the rewards just have to continue to be there to continue to motivate you. And at least from what I've learned in the Bible, the best thing to ever drive you is to love God. If you love God and you feel called by God to a ministry, nothing and no one will deter you. We've had people leave the church, and I've been told this by them, because I forgot to say thank you to them for something they did in the church. Bro, you never thanked me. So I always do this because I'm a smart aleck, for lack of a better word. I always say, well, I didn't know you were doing this for me. You should have told me. I thought you were doing this to serve the Lord, and I'm sure he's keeping really good track. You can either have your rewards here, or you can have them later. You can have me thank you and clap. We can bring up and say, oh, look at this guy. Is he awesome? Or you can get your rewards in heaven. But I can't live and die with that. I forgot to say thank you, or you've been a great help, or aren't you wonderful? Aren't you great? Man, we really need you. I'll wear out and I'll forget somebody, and I'll make them angry and mad, Rewards aren't good for motivating to serve. Hey, if God's called you, then go serve the Lord. And may your reward and your blessing come from him, and be thankful for that. Doesn't mean we don't appreciate you. I'm so thankful of the work of God. But just to watch and see him work, he's the one who should be thanked. So he doesn't offer him any awards, and I like that a lot. I was thinking, Nehemiah just trusted the Lord, and we read that this morning. Unless the Lord build the city, right? You're just building in vain. Unless the Lord watch the town, the guy with the gun at the gate at 3 a.m. is really no good to you, because it's the Lord who has to protect. I thought of David this week when he went out to see his brothers, and Goliath was out there spewing all that garbage about the God of Israel. And David said, have you guys heard what he's saying? And it infuriated David, because David loved the Lord. And the soldier said, yeah, he's been at this for 6 weeks almost. But our king, Saul, has recently given a reward, or offered a reward, that whoever would kill this guy, shut him up, he would get free tax living for the rest of his life. He'd get a third of the kingdom that the king ruled, and he'd get his good-looking daughter as a wife. But so far, no takers. And David said, forget the reward. This guy's got to die. He's talking smack about my God. And I'll just go out there and fight him in the name of the Lord, if that'll be all right. He could care less about the reward. He was driven by God, the love for the Lord. So Nehemiah doesn't do that. He just basically said, look at the problem we're facing. It's a spiritual issue. We need to build. And then I love verse 18, because he was able to testify to them of all that God had done to get him to this point. In fact, he could tell them to open the doors of the meeting hall and say, look out there, you see that truck out there filled with wood? Yeah, but that's a present from the king. And there's more where that came from. The Home Depot truck is parked right around the corner, and we got, all the stuff that we need. Nehemiah was able to just bring to the people the work that God had done. And I think organizing and leading people is much easier when you've already agonized before God and found what he wants. You're not selling, a plan or a program. Nehemiah doesn't have to walk in front of this crowd and say, join me. Nehemiah can walk before the people and say, join him. Look what he's been doing. Look what the king has given us. Look at the good hand of God upon us. And planning without agonizing is never good. Agonizing without planning won't get you anywhere. But Nehemiah had done both. And so he could honestly say to the people, here's what God has done. Won't you join him? Let's build. And notice in verse 18 that immediately the response of the people was, yeah, we want to do this. Let's put ourselves to work. Let's set our hands to do this good work. And he didn't have to sell anything. He could just let God be God. And it's amazing to me, when God begins to work, people love to join. We were at the Harvest here a week or two ago, and people now have to be turned away from a baseball stadium. But 20 years ago, there were 300 people on Monday nights at Calvary Costa Mesa. The place was 1/5 full. And there weren't nearly as many people going, hey, let's go see what God is doing. But now there's a lot of stuff going on, right? It's on television. It's, you can hear about it. It makes the front page of the newspaper. People go, hey, we should go there. God's doing stuff over there. And there's a lot of Johnny-come-latelys, so to speak, who gravitate towards the work of God because they see the work of God. And that's all Nehemiah did. He went, check out the truck. You ain't going to believe how I got here. 7 months ago, and he got to tell them the whole deal. And people went, maybe the Lord would have us do this. And 4 generations of folks without a wall are excited to build one. Get a vision, share the vision, and then hear the opposition, verse 19. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, Geshem, the Arab, heard of it, they laughed at us and they despised us. And they said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? And I answered them and I said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no heritage, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. Nearly every step of victory in the book of Nehemiah is followed by a mention of the opposition. And a couple of things I think are interesting. First of all, back in chapter 2, verse 9 or 10, verse 10, there were only 2 guys. Now there's 3. I know, not a big growth, but that's 50%. And eventually there'll be armies that have joined them. The opposition grows as the work of God goes forth. So here's 3 guys instead of 2. And notice that they come now with scorn and they come with accusations of rebellion. Nehemiah might very well have said, well, let me just show you the king's letters, and here's his American Express card. See, it's signed the king. And then he might have done a lot of things. Let me just bring you a couple of the king's ambassadors who've been riding with me. He could have had a good argument to argue with these guys. He didn't bother. And I think it's pretty wise that you don't leave the building for the battling, The work of God should go first. You should never get sidetracked by the opposition, because the opposition's coming. If you're serving the Lord, the enemy hates it. He doesn't want people to get saved. He doesn't want you to walk with God. He doesn't want you to find, the joy of the Lord in serving him. He's going to take you out if he can. So, the opposition is always there. What Nehemiah does do is handles it pretty well. He just says, well, the Lord's going to be with us. And he mentions that they have no heritage. That's a word for the past. You have no right. That's a present tense term. And you have no memorial, no future here. The enemy has never found a place in the things of God. He's always been the opposer. But he doesn't really preoccupy himself or become sidetracked or distracted by these guys who are saying, you're rebelling. He just says, well, we'll just serve the Lord. And I think sometimes the best answer that you can have when people begin to turn against you is to just say, well, we'll just see what God will do. It's not my battle. It's not my work. You can say what you like. Because you can spend, I remember Pastor Chuck at ministry school years ago used to say to us, if you're called to be a fireman, you run around and put out fires, but a pastor doesn't do that. You just let it go. God will figure it out. Now, eventually these guys will be an army of folks, and they will be yelling at them things like, hey, if a fox jumps on the wall, thing's going to fall over. And they laugh at how crooked it is. And I believe halfway that it was probably not real straight. I mean, these weren't construction workers. These were priests, guys who sold meat for a living, who were farmers. So building a straight wall was probably a big daunting challenge. But, the thing is, when that opposition began to yell at them, they were yelling from the other side of the wall. Yeah, keep yelling, buddy. I can't hear you. What'd you say? Yeah, okay. Better that you don't become too preoccupied with the enemy. So, get the vision, share the vision, opposition. In fact, next week, or maybe for 2 weeks, before we go on to chapter 3, I want to stop and go through the book kind of as a whole and look at what opposition does and what we should do in response. Because I think it'll be worth it that we know that before we start in chapter 3 with the walls being built and the enemy coming on strong. Father, thank you this morning for your word to us. What a good book Nehemiah is. May every one of us learn both how to hear what you want for us and then to go about sharing that work of God in our hearts with others who might join us in a work. And we thank you, Father, that not everyone's called to the same work. That certainly our church is filled with folks who love to go to the convalescent home and others who like to go to the prisons and other folks who like to go door to door and just share their faith, and still others who love to sing or watch the kids or teach the junior hires or the high schoolers or the college. God, that you might build the church so the gates of hell do not prevail. But that we might learn from Nehemiah as he leads how we can get out of the way and let you work and have biblical reasons to believe so. Maybe this morning God has been stirring your heart. Do you know what you're supposed to be doing now with your life in the Lord, where you're supposed to be serving? Do you know what God's calling is upon your heart? What was this year's plans to be? What are next year's plans for you? What has God been showing you? Good to be thinking forward. God will still have to bring it to pass, but you can do your best and then commit the rest. But do your best. You need prayer. The prayer room is open. Maybe you don't know the Lord, and you haven't met Jesus, and you don't know why he came and died and shed his blood for you so that you could go to heaven, not on your merit, but his. What he's promised to do for sinners who will look to him. The prayer room is right out front here on your left. It would behoove you. Just take a few minutes, walk in the door and say to someone, hey, what does it mean to be saved? And what do I need to know that I'm going to go to heaven when I die? God will meet you there and bless you. And for the rest of you who know the Lord, may the challenge for your life this week be, where am I supposed to be in serving God? What is he doing in my life? There's a million places to serve here in the church, but I would be, presumptuous to tell you where you should serve. I have no idea. You go where God shows you. You go to the church God shows you. But be faithful to his calling.